Hi there, this is Freelance Game Development with Unity. I am Will Patillo. This lecture was originally given for the June 2023 UnityPDX meetup. Here's a little outline of what I'll be talking about, a little about myself, types of jobs, how to get a job, how to protect yourself with a contract, be going into detail on some billing practices and client management, and then ending with some notes on just staying sane through the whole process. I started learning game development in Unity in about 2016 by working full-time on a self-directed project called Will-O-Wisp VR, which I've launched on Steam. Had basically zero commercial success, but was an incredible learning project. And the next year, I built several prototypes, including an ecology simulator, something simulating logic gates, and a variety of other things. I was an unpaid intern for about 4 months or so for Forgotten Minds LLC as they were building this game called War to the Core, which I think may be still be in development. I had several short-term part-time freelance gigs in the year after that, and which ultimately led to getting a full-time lead programming position for the game Rogue Invader, which is available on Steam and the Epic Game Store. And that's the largest single project I've worked on. I've more recently started Zen Marmot Digital. I'm currently working on a bullet hell game called Oscillarium, and also a more casual, mobile game called Checkers Survivors. And I've also been on the hiring end. So at the end of my internship at Forgotten Minds, I then interviewed a number of other potential interns and picked which one should replace me. I also hired some subcontractors for Rogue Invader, and then also had to hire some artists and musicians for some of my current projects. This was from Will-O-Wisp VR, so you can see those are the swords that I'm holding. This is fighting the end boss. This is a screenshot from War to the Core, and this is Rogue Invader. It's a pixel art, side-scrolling roguelike, lots of explosions. This is a screenshot from Oscillarium. So it's a bullet hell game, which we're just kind of trying to match the colors. And instead of losing health when you make incorrect touches, it just tracks your percentage. So that way you go through the entire level every single time. You get to make the focus a little bit more on the patterns and interacting with them rather than just intense difficulty. Just to mention some of the different types of jobs. And now, as a little caveat here, I've only worked in a few of these types of companies. The rest of them are based off of things that I've read in books, GDC videos, gossip on social media, talking to people. So some of this information is secondhand. At the largest, there are the AAA companies. If you work for one of these, your job's probably going to be pretty specialized. They're also notorious for demanding crunch, where you work, really long hours just for an extended period of time. Hopefully that's gotten better over the years, as a lot of people have spoken up against it. But that's a possibility that you'll run into that. AA companies. So this is like a step smaller, more like mid-size, from there. An example is Ready at Dawn has a VR office here in Portland. And I think they're a very good example of a AA company. These just seem all around awesome to work for if you can get it. But the barrier to entry for getting hired for one of these seems really high, as in you would have to be senior level in some other line of work to be a junior at one of these. Smaller still, you have the more tiny studios. These are often referred to as indie, which isn't technically accurate given the origin of the term. That's kind of how the word's used these days. In terms of working there, the skill set required is going to be a lot more general compared to AAA. It seems to be kind of hard to find stability there, as companies are constantly appearing, disappearing, falling through. Some things get published, some don't. Then you could form your own startup, which you don't have to convince anyone, except that there's always really a gatekeeper of some kind. If there isn't someone who's deciding whether to hire you or not, then your gatekeeper is the market. Invest a lot in the game, but if no one buys it, then you're not getting paid anything. In fact, in this route is in many ways the hardest, and you can expect to lose a lot of money if you go this route, and you might get lucky. But I've noticed that most of the success stories in the startup category tend to be people jumping from somewhere else, like a group of people at a AAA company, don't like the management. And so they kind of get a bunch of friends together and say, "Hey, we're the real talent here. Let's form our own group and not have to deal with any of this noise." So if you're just kind of going into it because you can't get into something else, that's going to be a very uphill climb, and a deceptive one, because no one's telling you no until you're actually launching something. Next, even, I guess, not really a job, but is the hobbyist. So yeah, I could imagine this as being like kind of going the startup route, but without the investment. So like rather than paying a bunch of money or going into it, quitting your job and making it full time, maybe just like work a little bit on a project like after hours, in your spare time. This certainly decreases risk, but it's going to take obviously going to take a lot longer to build a game. And if you're not really investing it, it's going to be hard to compete against all the games launching all the time where people, really are investing heavily in it. So this is going to be a very hard route to get anything commercial. But if your goal is to learn, approaching it as a hobby is a fantastic way to learn. So if that's your goal, that's great. Then lastly, the thing I'll be talking about for most of this lecture is the freelance route, which is where I've spent most of my time. This has fairly flexible hours. Sometimes you'll get a client that's really demanding and maybe a bit of a crunch here and there. Barrier to entry is fairly reasonable. I'll talk more about that later in terms of assessing whether you're ready. Stability's okay. There'll be, multiple month-long periods here and there where you're in between jobs and finding new ones. I'd say the biggest downside to the freelance route is that the requirements include both technical and business savvy. Like you have to be a good programmer if that's, your freelance programming. But you also have to have a bunch of skills in terms of finding clients and client management. I mean, yes, soft skills are necessary in all of these other companies as well. Like you need to be able to work with people, but there's an extra level to that when you're dealing with clients rather than just collaborators. So next, those were the types of jobs. Now within that, the types of clients. I kind of put this on like a categories on like levels. So at the level 0, this is your prototypical like idea guy, someone who just has an idea for a game they want to build because they've played a bunch of games, and there's some game that they really like, but they wish it was a little bit different, and they want to make that, but they're not really willing to invest in it, nor have they like studied what game development's all about, and one of the big warning signs on this is if they ask to pay revenue share. If you get one of these opportunities, and they show up pretty frequently, I'd say just don't bother. You're never going to see a dime from projects like this, and you could both learn more and have more fun just making things on your own. Projects that you make yourself, it's more likely you'll even have something that you can put on a resume in terms of like a portfolio sort of work. There's really just nothing to be gained by working for someone who has nothing to offer. All right, so next is level 1. And this is someone who's like still kind of the idea guy sort of person, but is like actually willing to put some money on the table. But not a lot. Like they're wanting to hedge their bets. And they'll typically come in and ask for like building a demo or a prototype. And so these kind of jobs are going to be relatively low paying. The duration will be short, like maybe a couple of months. And they're also, again, fairly unlikely to get published. However, if you're not really sure of yourself, or you don't have much on your resume and like getting work elsewhere is difficult, this can be a fantastic starting point. Moving on to level 2. This is kind of like level 1 again, where like they're not necessarily like into the games industry yet. They haven't like done a ton of reading. They haven't worked in the field. But unlike level one, they're willing to put a lot of money into this. Like they really built up some savings. They maybe have some funding sources, and you can just tell that they're absolutely committed towards publishing something. These clients provide some really good, stable work. One downside is as a freelancer, you probably not going to get a huge amount of creative control because they're going to be very attached to their ideas, given how much they're investing in it. I'd say this kind of work is fantastic for experience and resume building and just paying the bills, maybe even building up some savings. And then yeah, that moves on to level 3. So this is going to be a established company, or maybe it's a new company, but like people who've been in the games industry for a while. They kind of know how things work, and they have this process. They know what their market is and all those things, and they even have some people working on the project, but they're just not able to meet there's some timeline that they want to meet that they just don't have enough hands to get there, and they need some extra help. Uh, so yeah, this is some pretty good stable work right here. Then finally, there's level 4. This is again like level 3. It's some people that are more established and know what they want. Rather than just needing extra help, there's some specialized work that not very many people know how to make. It's not just like game development. It's maybe like advanced shader programming, or using machine learning or data science, or something like something that not many game developers have. It's something that pretty extensively, and they're hiring you specifically for your unique expertise. If you find work along these lines, make sure to charge for it, because if you've gotten here, you've earned it. Okay, so that's the types of work. Next, I'll talk a little bit about getting a job. Unfortunately, there aren't really any secrets here. Just like basic job hunting knowledge that you would see anywhere else. Just cover the basics. So join job listing forums. Here in Portland, there's the Portland Indie Game Squad. They have a looking for work channel on Discord. If you're in a different city somewhere else, there may be something similar. So look around for that. Pig Squad's a really great community. People very supportive. If you're in Portland, I super recommend joining that. More broadly, there's game industry jobs on Facebook, put on by the indie game developers. And then also, join any other things you can find. I haven't tried out Upwork or Fiverr or any of those, but you might find something good there. And then besides looking for jobs, make sure to assemble your resume, have a portfolio put together, and then also have some GitHub repositories that show off at least one project that you're proud of. A smart interviewer isn't going to just ask you questions. They're going to look at code that you've written. Next one, a common topic in job searching is the idea of networking. Really, there's nothing super unusual about this. It's just like, it's just basic stuff. If there are community events, those are like really fun and awesome. So go to them. You're making cool things, so show those off. Other people are making cool things, like take an interest and like ask questions about it and talk to them, just because it's fun. And then as you're doing all that, every once in a while an opportunity will pop up, and so just keep your eyes open and be ready to ask follow-up questions if that happens. But if it doesn't, you're participating in a fun event, so there's like no harm there. One helpful mindset I like to have when networking is, rather than like thinking about like jobs and money and all that sort of stuff, just think about like game jams. Like, because I participate in game jams at least once a year. Those are really fun, and they're a great chance to see what it's like to work with specific people. When I'm at like game development social events, I kind of keep an eye out what I want to work with on a game jam. Speaking of which, game jams are awesome. You should totally participate in those. One thing I would say that is a little bit of like, that's not common advice that I could give, that's like the closest I have to like a secret, is don't be too picky about job listings. So like if someone just posts on a forum saying like, hey, buy project, and then they have some like not very impressive looking sketches where you can't tell what the game's about. I need some help on this. Can anyone contact me? And they don't really say whether it's paid or what the company structure is like or anything about it. And it's like, oh man, this seems really disorganized. like talk to them first. Like go reach out, say like I'd like a little bit more information. And if you talk to them and you get this intuitive feel of like, oh, this doesn't feel right, then obviously go with that. Like protect yourself, but don't just make a judgment just based off of a listing. And an analogy I give here is like when you're interviewing, there's interview skills and then there's job skills. And those maybe correlate, but they're not the same. And so if you're looking for work, you want someone to hire you based on whether you're qualified, not just based on how well you interviewed. And so this also goes the other way. Like writing a job listing is a skill, and there are some very good employers who just don't have that skill. So try to look past it. And this can be a really big benefit because most of the jobs that I've either gotten or received, the competition was like 3 applicants or something really small like that. If you look at a listing that just isn't well put together, not very many people apply to it. If you're someone who does, that puts you at a huge advantage rather than going for a job where like hundreds of people have applied. Another note I want to say about getting a job as a freelancer is this is something you kind of only have to solve like for a little short section of your career. Once you've gotten a little bit of work, then you can rely on repeat clients and referrals to get additional work, assuming you do a good job and they want to rehire you, which that's an important thing, which we'll talk about next. So one personal story I'll give on this that I think ties a lot of these ideas together. When I was like just kind of taking little odd jobs here and there on Pig Squad's channel, there was a listing for the Rogue Invader job, which I just kind of passed over because the listing just didn't look very interesting. Didn't think about it for a while until I was at a meetup event. I think it was like preparing for like a speed meeting for a game jam. And I was showing off my neural network visualizer to some people since that's what I was working on at the time. One person I was showing it to was very impressed by it and said like, "Oh, hey, you clearly know a lot about Unity. I just took on this job working for this Rogue Invader game. I'm primarily an Unreal developer. I can take care of myself on this, but there's some like Unity specific things that it'd be nice to have a consultant on so that I could hit the ground running quickly and be as efficient as possible." So I got hired on as a subcontractor for this, working for the contractor to consult with some things, take on a few minor tasks. And then a couple months in, the primary contractor got a job somewhere else. And so I was the obvious person to replace them. And then that led to 2 years of full-time freelance work. Okay, so let's say you haven't had any significant amount of game development work yet. You may be asking yourself, am I ready? Like if I take on a job, will it just feel like a total imposter? Will I be overwhelmed? Am I up for this? Have I learned enough? And this is definitely something that I worried about for quite a bit before actually finding work. I'll say on this that it's okay if you're just a generalist, like if you don't have some like specific things that really make you stand out. The important thing in terms of readiness is that you can handle scale. That is, as projects, there's a tendency when projects get bigger that there's like lots of errors start popping up, and then you fix one and that causes something else to break, and you fix that causes something else to break, and you fix that, and then the whole thing breaks, and you're just spending all of your time playing debug whack-a-mole rather than and the rate of adding new features just kind of gets less and less and less and less until you're just not making any progress at all. You're just fighting against your own code, adding hacks on hacks on hacks, and the whole thing falls apart. And it's unfortunately very common for software projects to die because of this dynamic. So you should be, if you're going to take on paid work, you need to have a process for preventing this from happening. One other thing that I kind of say is also a nice positive is if you're familiar enough with how code works and how things fit together that you can just jump right back into a project that you haven't worked on for over 3 months, not have to spend a dozen hours like acquainting yourself. You can just go right in and say, okay, I want to add this thing. Here's where it would be. Okay, this is what's in place. Here's what's not. And all right, now I'm going to add it. Those criteria are pretty vague. So I'd say a more specific learning benchmark is you should be familiar with concepts like design patterns and polymorphism. If you know what those are and you're familiar, You just choose not to use them because you have some other way of solving the problems that those solve. That's cool. But if those are like unfamiliar words, then you should probably study a little bit more before you try to get people to pay you. This may sound a bit harsh, but where I'm coming from on this is almost every major project I've worked on, I've had to rescue from sloppy prior developers who, built things, got in over their head, didn't communicate that early on, and then just ended up making this house of cards that was, then when it started collapsing, then they left. And then I had to come in, often just delete huge swaths of code, sometimes even start over from scratch on things that have been worked on for years. That's kind of bad for everyone. So make sure that doesn't happen. And the key to that is being able to handle scale. Yeah, so one other progression I can also describe in terms of skill levels. If you can just like have any idea and build it in isolation, and that's really exciting. That's cool. That's awesome. That's a junior level, and I would say maybe that's good enough for like a level 1 client. If the project isn't going to get super scaled up anyways. But once you get beyond that, I'd say that's not enough. Someone who I'd say is a competent professional can add and change to a project endlessly. Maybe it'll get a little bit slower over time, but not in like an exponential way that falls off to nothing. So that's the level to get at. And then the level to aspire to, the expert level, is when almost everything you use becomes a resource that you can leverage to accelerate development, and so that progress actually gets faster because you just have more stuff available that you can draw off of. In terms of like getting your portfolio together and on your resume, when I'm in a position of hiring a programmer, I'll typically look for 3 things in their background. One is something that's finished, so I know that they understand the game development process from beginning to end. Second is having contributed meaningfully to something big, so that they know how to work with issues relating to scale. And third is that they've worked on something collaborative, like a game jam, for example, just so that they know how to integrate their code with other people. Okay, so you're landed a job, great. And now you're worried that, oh, what if these are total strangers I'm working with? What if I get ripped off? So the most important thing, have a contract, get a lawyer. This is your livelihood, so it's worth investing in. And it's not as expensive as you might think. Like, expect to pay like a couple $100 for that initial consult and contract and some starting advice. And when you have that, you can reuse it. But just taking a template off the internet is probably not a good idea, because most of the work, lawyers have templates. So like they're able to cut that corner themselves, and they know what to edit. And most of the work that you'd be paying a lawyer for is the thing that you can't just get for free online. And that is clarifying exactly what it is you want and asking non-obvious questions early on, so that you can get an answer and make sure you're on the same page with the client, or if you disagree, negotiate that before it becomes an issue. So some examples of things that you might not think of if you're just putting together a contract yourself, this is not an exhaustive list, are things like, can I put this in my portfolio after, while I'm working on this or after I leave? If I write some general purpose code, can I put that in a personal library and use that in future projects, or does it belong to the client and can't be used outside it in any way? If one of us wants to leave, what's the process for terminating the contract? And then, what's the payment method and frequency? Now, another element to protecting yourself is just making sure you're working with people who are trustworthy, and making sure you just have a positive relationship. Because if that's in place, you very rarely have to actually lean on the contract. The contract is really for making sure you're agreeing to things up front and getting clear communication, putting it in writing so people don't forget. But anyway, in terms of trustworthiness of people, I like to follow, or I believe in what I call the 10-80-10 rule, and this applies to like all kinds of things, like classroom teaching, like social dynamics, all sorts of things. And this idea is that you have a minority of people who are really awesome and wonderful and like don't need any pushing or prompting ever. And if you can find a relationship like that, hold on to it because it's like gold. And then there's a smaller minority that are jerks and will lie and try to rip you off and just act in bad faith. And then there's the big group in the middle that want to be good, but don't necessarily know how to communicate their intentions or the social etiquette or expectations, and also want to protect themselves first. Because this is like where most people are, most of your work in protecting yourself, this is kind of what you should assume. Don't just assume that things will work themselves out because, everyone's nice, because that's a minority. Don't push people away out of fear that they're lying, because then that's an even smaller minority. Just instead focus on being a clear guiding hand. Clear expectations, again, in writing, through a contract and ongoing communication, so that you bring the best out in people. And if you actively bring the best out in people, then you're going to have good experiences. And so knowing how to do that is really the key thing. Regarding those people who are, not necessarily behaving in integrity, your big lever is stop work. Like, yes, you can get involved in litigation and contract disputes and that sort of thing. Having worked as a paralegal for a couple of years, I can say that being anything involved with the court system kind of sucks for everyone. So that's really, really a last resort. However, one thing that is available to you is like, say someone just doesn't pay you. It's the first of the month, time to pay for your work over that month, and they don't, and they give some weird excuse about like, oh, the money's coming in and I need to I have the funding secured, but like there's some hang up with the bank, and it's just kind of stalling, and stuff that they should have taken care of weeks ago. Well, your response to that is to just not work on their project anymore, because the reason nobody's going to be getting into this kind of deal in order to rip you off. Like they want to make something, and if you're not building the thing for them, then that puts them in a bind. Like their time is going by, they're losing that, they're not making any progress. So that's actually a really big lever that you have. It's very unlikely that they're going to just like pull something totally out of left field that tricks you. Usually the warning signs for this are they'll try to push you to not adhere to your own boundaries. Like saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't have a contract. Let's just keep it casual. I don't want all that like formal kind of stuff. When like you have rules and then they just kind of ask you to not have rules or to not follow the rules that you have. People who have integrity won't ask for that. Okay, so one specific topic on the subject of forming contracts is like, what's your agreement going to be? A very important part of this is billing, because there's basically two halves to an agreement. There's what you make, and then there's what you get paid for it. So this is like half of the equation here. And one particularly contentious point in billing that I want to spend a bit extra time on is having an hourly rate versus charging a flat fee. And theoretically, there are pluses and minuses to each. On the one hand, the client doesn't really care about your hours. They're paying for how much progress they get. But on the other hand, what you're selling is your time. I enjoy building games. What I charge for as a freelancer is the fact that the time I spend on one project, I can't be spending on something else. One substantive difference is risk. When it's an hourly rate, the client is taking the risk because they don't know exactly how much they're going to pay. And if it's a flat fee, then I, as the freelancer, take on the risk. Because the client knows exactly what they're getting and how much what it's going to cost, but I don't know how much work I'm going to put in. So if you take these things together, like the theory from the client's perspective versus yours, the risk on the client's perspective versus yours, this may seem like going with a flat fee is a good selling point. It's like, okay, well, I'll take on a bunch of different clients. I hope that, everything's kind of evens out. I'll take on the risks so the client has one less thing to worry about, because there's all kinds of risks that they're dealing with in starting up a business. And this is how I used to think. the fact that I'm taking on a risk of like, I don't know how long a task is going to be, that kind of seems reasonably like that's my problem because I should be able to estimate hours for clearly defined tasks. Engineers will often complain about how estimating hours is really hard and like they just don't know how long things will take until they start working on it. I don't think that's really, I think that gets overstated. There's like a really easy process for getting good at estimating time. The key is to separate precision from accuracy. Precision is, I say something's going to be 10 hours and it's between 9 and 11, something really close to what I say, or it's like, within a very narrow range. Accuracy is that the error isn't concentrated on one side. If I say it's going to be 10 hours, there's an equally good chance it'll be 5 as it'll be 20 if I'm using like percentage. If you make a bunch of estimates and they all have an equal chance of being over as they are of being under, you're accurate. Even if they're all wildly off, as long as the distribution is even, that's pretty good accuracy, and I would call that good estimating. What's bad is if you consistently underestimate how long things will take. Let's say you say it's 10 hours and it's actually 20. You say it's 50, it's actually 100. You say it's 90, it's actually 180. And if that's happening repeatedly, that's inaccurate and it's dishonest. Because the way that you build accuracy is you take on a task, then you measure how long, you guess how long it's going to take, then you measure how long it actually takes, and then you compare your guess to the reality. And if you see a pattern where things are off by a certain percentage, then you just adjust that in your future estimates. So, a new thing comes up and I say, all right, I think I consult my intuition. I feel this is going to take roughly 20 hours because I can imagine myself going through all of it, and each bit, kind of adds up to 20. However, I noticed I tend to always guess about half as like things always take twice as long as they actually take. And each time it's for some like individual reason, like something comes up and I get interrupted. Something turns out to be harder than it is. It's always something unpredictable, but it always just seems to happen. So now, even though I feel this is going to take 20 hours, I'm just going to say it's going to take 40, and that's what my estimate's going to be because I'm always off in this way. If you apply these offsets repeatedly, eventually that starts to fuse into your intuition, and then you don't need to apply the offsets anymore because you just kind of get a sense of estimating the unknown, of accounting for the unknown unknowns. So that's how you give accurate estimates. So given that there's things are balanced and you kind of want to make things appealing to the client and you should be able to give good estimates, this would kind of seem like, oh yeah, flat fee is the way to go. The problem is that most clients, certainly at the level 1 and 2, are not going to give you clearly defined tasks. Very frequently run into specifications that are vague or incomprehensible. And then if you try to clarify things with just verbal communication through meetings, those are often not much better, and it takes like ages to get just a partial specification on one feature. Things that look really simple on paper turns out that they interconnect with a ton of other things and are actually like hugely complicated in ways that are just you can't tell from looking at the documentation. And then there's also like assumptions about various extras. So I remember one occasion I was working on a flat fee task, and my estimate for completing the code aspect of the task was like dead on. I used up the time that I had allocated for myself. Maybe it took a little longer than I thought, and I absorbed that. But it was fine. And then the client was saying, so your coding on this task includes full documentation, right? Like with a whole separate document that describes like how I use everything, comments on every single line of code, and like each comment block describing like that I can walk through step by step everything that's happening so I can edit the self. Like this is all included in that because that's just part of coding, right? No, that wasn't my assumption. Like I include documentation as I need it. As for myself as a developer for things that I, might forget in a couple of months, but that I can't just pick up from just looking at the code itself. And this is a perfectly fine for the client to want that level of documentation, but it's not something it would have ever occurred to me to ask about when we were negotiating the contract. And so we had a different view of what was required for this work to be done. This is a problem because we've already set how much is being paid. So if I say like no, then the client's not happy. If I try to raise the price, then it feels like a bait and switch from their perspective, where I agreed to one price when it was really a different one. And if I just agree to it, then I'm spending a lot of hours working for free. That's setting up a conflict of interest and poisoning the relationship. And that's really like the really critical thing when you're making an agreement with someone, is to make sure that your interests are aligned. And this is more important than almost anything. And this is a general rule with flat fees on not a clearly defined task, is that you will consistently benefit from the simplest interpretation of the tasks. The client benefits from the most involved interpretation of tasks because that gets them more stuff. So if you're wanting to pull in different directions, that's setting you up to argue. Now, this might not be a problem with more established companies that have like a really established workflow for like how they write specifications. But in general, this is something that's just like a built-in conflict. Whereas with hourly, it doesn't matter. Like, hey, we go with the simple interpretation, great, takes me less time. Go with the complex interpretation, great, I get paid more. Like, I don't care. I can lay out each of those paths. What's the simple is going to cost, what I can create an estimate for the more complex version, and then the client can weigh the trade-offs and decide whether the extra functionality is important to them, and that's how it should be, because those are choices that they should be making. So it's still great to kind of look at features and say, this is how long I think these are going to take, so that they can get some sense of how much things are going to cost. It's even fine to do that for the entire project based on what you know about. Just make sure that you're not like held to that, and it's just kind of your guess to give them a kind of a ballpark sense of how things are. Because once it's binding, then you're basically in flat fee territory again. So if you're going for an hourly rate, what should that rate be? The really critical thing here is don't negotiate. Like, know what your rate is. If it's variable based on the type of client, the type of work, a number of other factors, know what those are in advance, so that by the time you've had your initial interview, you can say, like, this is what my rate is. So in the interest of transparency, my rate is $40 an hour. I could probably charge more, but I'm wanting to be, fairly picky with what projects I take on. The first jobs when I started out working with those like level 1 clients I mentioned, and this was also years ago, those were at like $20 an hour. I then worked up towards 30. 40 is my rate now. When I work on projects that are not game development, then it's higher. And then I'd also be willing to adjust downwards if there was a lot of creative collaboration involved. I'm not just implementing features, but I'm actually have a say in what gets made. I'd be willing to charge less. So that's me. You don't necessarily have to go with that, but I'm just giving that as an anchor, because I know it can be very overwhelming when you're trying to decide what to charge, and everyone's like, oh, just decide for yourself, and like there's no rules, and like, yeah, but like what's my anchor point? So this is one, use it how you will. Oh, also, I'll say on rates, if you're going to be working on a project for a long time, consider working in raises, just because they're kind of hard to ask for later when you already have a contract signed. Don't nickel and dime clients. So for example, if there's small costs like assets, just pay for those yourself, and rather than trying to offload those onto the client. You're going to be making all of your money from your hourly rate. Like that's the big ticket item. There's like this weird psychological thing where people like weigh things based on like the number of decisions being made rather than the weight of the decisions. So if you have like lots of little costs, that's going to seem like you're more expensive than if you're covering all those, but your base rate's a little bit higher, which is actually like them paying more overall. For just whatever reason, like that just doesn't seem like as much. And I've also seen it's not at all uncommon to have a 1-hour discussion, pushing back and forth on whether to use a $10 asset when your rate is $40. That makes no sense, but it happens. So if you just kind of pay for that, then that conversation doesn't need to happen. Don't squeeze the client and try to get as much as you can. Just make sure that you're getting enough for yourself that the job is worthwhile. You know, if you take something on because you're really desperate for work, and then 6 months in, you're just really not happy with it and you're wanting to leave to get something better, and you feel like you're just not being compensated fairly, you know, right after you've gotten established in your workflow, that's kind of bad for everyone. So just make sure your rate is high enough that the job is actually worthwhile. Hopefully you find work, but if you pass up on projects that are not a good fit, that's also for the best. Then is, how do you measure hours? Like what counts? Tracking hours, like a lot of people get like scared by that or think it's going to take up a lot of time and be this big hassle. It really isn't. Like, you don't need to be super detailed. Just be honest. My process is, you know, when I keep an Excel spreadsheet per client, and when I start working, I track the time. When I stop working, I, you know, input the time, and then I put a little description as to what I was working on. And those are just for myself. When I put together a bill, I'll use a free invoice generator. You can find it online. Just put in the hours. I don't really go into all the detail. I'll ask the client, like, hey, if you want me to give detail, I have that and I can share that with you. No one's ever asked. If you're going faster than they expect, then they don't need any detail. Detail is just like if there's a dispute, you can provide it. So yeah, Excel is what I use. Some freelancers I know are a little more fancy and they use Toggle, which is like this free online application. Basically works like a stopwatch. It doesn't have to be a huge deal. And then in terms of what counts as billable time, one adage I took from working as a paralegal that I like to follow is that a professional is someone who applies general knowledge in specific circumstances. So you can use that as a kind of a filter for like whether time counts or not. So examples of things that are billable, well, working on the project, obviously. Meetings, definitely bill for meetings at your highest rate. Otherwise, they're not going to end. Technical assistance on like setting up version control and so on. And this is a bit of a gray area, but I would also include learning project-specific concept. But what isn't billable are your initial consultation and your, convincing the client to hire you. Casual conversations about like games you were playing last weekend or whatever, like, a little bit of time at the beginning of meetings. Administrative work, like tracking your hours and putting together, bills and so on, like that doesn't count. And also learning general concepts and professional development. So as an example, when I was working on Rogue Invader, there was a point where we needed to have the characters moving around, and it made sense to use Unity's nav mesh agents for that, which I hadn't used before. And so I need to go through a couple of tutorials, learning the basics of Unity's nav mesh agents. That's like a really general skill that like anyone who uses Unity should know. I didn't happen to know it at the time, so I didn't bill for that. So when I was working on that, I brought up a separate project, followed some YouTube videos, did some experiments of my own, and I didn't bill for that time. If what's billable is applying general knowledge in specific circumstances, building that general knowledge is not part of this. So like if you're lacking general knowledge and you're working on getting that, that's not billable. But if you have it and then you're using it, then that is. Going back to what your billable rate should be, just know that non-billable time is going to be a certain percentage of the total time that you spend. So just make sure that's factored in. Before I start getting into the last couple of slides on client management, I take a little break and watch this YouTube video called The Expert. Pause the video, watch that, have some fun with it, and then resume this video when you're done. Okay, now that you're back, let's have a couple of discussion questions or things to just think about. First, like, what's going on with this client? Like, why are they being so ridiculous? Second, did the expert handle the meeting well? If not, what might you have done to handle the situation differently? So again, pause the video, take a moment, come up with some answers to those questions. Like, you try to like really think about that and engage with it. And then when you're done, unpause. So now that you're back, let's discuss that video a little, or I'm gonna give my take on it, I should say. The video is obviously ridiculous because they're using examples of things that like pretty much everyone knows, and so for a client not to get it is absurd. But it's that dynamic that they describe in the video is actually like eerily accurate to conversations that happen on a weekly basis. And there's a couple of like common pitfalls that just is very common across clients. Like if you see it, it's not that individual being weird. It's a dynamic that happens pretty frequently. And so one of them is when a client doesn't know what they want, but then like speaks with a lot of confidence despite that. This like seems weird, but it's actually should be pretty unsurprising, because if they knew what they want, they probably wouldn't be asking for you for help. They'd just be doing it themselves. And but also if they weren't confident, they wouldn't be taking huge financial risks, like hiring you. So then another, you know, kind of frustrating thing is when they start using like big technical words without knowing what they mean. You can see this in the video. Like it's pretty obvious to me that the client there did not know what perpendicular meant. You could see that when the client brought it up and they were like kind of confused. And then when one of the clients like drew 3 perpendicular lines just as a triangle, and those like weren't perpendicular, but like she thought that they were. My guess is that their understanding of perpendicular was just lines that are connected to each other at angles. They heard perpendicular used in that kind of context, and so they just kind of applied it there to make it sound like they were being specific. I think that's just kind of the nature of how people absorb language. Like people don't learn from like looking at dictionary definitions and then applying them. They hear words in context. Like, you know, we hear words in context, and then we use those reuse those words when we feel like we're in a similar context. And so when you're diving into a new, you know, field with that has lots of language that you haven't heard before, you kind of absorb things, but like don't quite get how to apply them. So this is a very normal thing to happen. So when you see it coming up, it's useful to just kind of ask, like, well, what do you actually mean by that? Or try to infer it based on how they're using the word, rather than just assuming a literal interpretation of everything that just doesn't make sense. And then the biggest issue is that kind of underlies everything is failing to separate design details or the design objectives from implementation details. This could look like insisting tasks being done in a very particular way as kind of an indirect way of making sure that they're done right. I think this, like, I used to think this was weird quirk, but then I also teach programming to kids, and I saw them doing the same thing. And that's gotten me to think that like this is actually a natural human tendency when kind of explaining a process to start with the conclusion and then like kind of be slow to work backwards. Let's take the draw red lines in green ink as an example. I don't know what the client was thinking because like you know, it's just a video. It never actually happened. I can't talk to them. But if I had to guess, and if I were to ask like, so why do you want these lines to be red? Then it might have gotten something along the lines of, well, we find that red is our market research shows that red really gets people's attention, and that's important for this project. Oh, okay, that's good. And why is it important that they're in green ink? Well, our supplier has, you know, this year has a surplus of green pens, and so they're willing to offer a discount. So we feel that green ink is going to be the most cost effective. Oh, okay. So what you really want here is something that's attention grabbing and also cost effective. Framed in that way, now we have a problem that's maybe difficult and maybe it involves some trade-offs, but is no longer this impossible, ridiculous contradiction anymore. That might not have been what the you know, what we actually got to if if you dug in a little bit deeper, but it might have been something else along those kind of lines. Some ways you can resolve these kind of contradictions as they come up. One particularly helpful thing is to ask the client to draw pictures, because pictures are specific in ways that words can be very vague and slippery. Next is to try to ask why behind a lot of decisions so that you can get at the underlying intention and broaden the solution space so there's more place for resolution. So this kind of is the general point. When something doesn't make sense, dig deeper before pushing back. And most of the time, that's all you need. Every once in a while, you'll get someone who isn't willing to explain their reasoning because it's confidential, or when you point something out, they just won't dig deeper no matter how much you prod, and they're just like really stubborn. It's like, well, why don't you just get it? And that's kind of toxic, and you know, maybe something that you'll want to step away from. But if you just see contradictions, you know, ask questions before it becomes a problem, and you can usually find a win-win. General notes on client management. First, try to set their expectations early regarding scope. The less surprised they are, the easier they're going to be to work with. Whenever you get to the points where there are a number of options, describe all the options you can think of and then give estimates for each so that they can make informed decisions. The more familiar you are with game design, the more creative you'll be in offering alternative options, and that'll often get you a lot of respect. One tactical kind of thing is uh, all the tasks that you work on as a programmer, they're kind of on a spectrum. On the one hand, you have things that are very easy, it will go quickly, and also can be like have a lot of visible progress. And on the other hand, you have tasks that are very difficult, take a lot of time, and the end result like kind of looks the same on the surface. So refactoring is a good example. And make sure as you're working like throughout the process to balance these. If you start off just taking on a bunch of easy tasks right at the beginning, that's going to set some unrealistic expectations. Like, oh, this is going to be done in like weeks. And then when things slow down because you're not working on the easy things anymore, they'll be confused by that. And on the other hand, if you just work on a lot of the hard stuff early on and say, oh, trust me, it's going to speed up later, that's going to create a really bad first impression. They won't know whether that's actually true or if you're just stonewalling. It's good to give suggestions regarding how you think the game could be better or more have a more cost-effective process. Just you have expertise, you should share that, and giving advice, and you're gonna want to anyway, like if you care about what you're working on. But this can run into conflict with just like arguing with the client. And it's their project, so like they get the final say, and if you're just kind of fighting with them about it, that's just going to create stress for everyone, especially yourself. So the rule I like to follow is say it once, because when you've given advice once, then you fulfilled your ethical obligation to provide a fair warning of future things that might come up. But once you start repeating yourself and you're giving the same advice over and over, they already heard you the first time, so the only effect of saying it again is just trying to pressure them into taking your advice. And again, that's not your decision to make. This is the last slide, is just on staying sane through the whole process. Unfortunate reality is that whatever quirks a client has, such as poor communication, are probably not going to get better while you're working with them. And you're also not going to get a lot of creative control, which is disappointing, because the reason anyone goes into game development, rather than some other higher paying, more stable line of work that uses the same skills, is so that they can make, as creative expression. So not having that can be a little bit of a downer, especially if you disagree with the direction that a project's going. One thing I like to keep in mind whenever I feel like the things I'm working on, like, oh, this doesn't make any sense, or this project isn't going to go anywhere, is remembering that you're selling a dream first and a project second. Yes, of course, clients want the thing they're making to sell 1 million copies and get a ton of money, and to be the start of a whole business that makes like lots of different projects and hires a bunch of people and grows and is big and everything. Really, what they're also buying is just that magical experience of having something in one's mind and seeing that come out into reality. And then there's also the fantasy of kind of like being in charge of things and running something. And so like that's a very big part of like what they're really paying you for, is to create that experience. This is something that isn't going to be said out loud, as kind of underneath the surface, but just be aware of that whenever it feels like what you're working on like doesn't make sense or whatever else. That it does, it's just maybe the scale is a little smaller. The last thing to keep in mind in terms of just making sure that everything feels worthwhile is that you're being paid in 3 things: money, experience, and creative expression. There is no correct balance between these 3 things, so long as the sum total of them all put together is worthwhile to you. If you'd like to hear more on the subject, on Infallible Code's channel has a video called Staying Sane, Keeping Clients Happy. Is by developer Jason Story. A lot of his perspective is pretty similar to mine, as he was also a freelancer and has some similar views, but you also differ in some ways. And so, yeah, if you just want to see another perspective, that's another video that I highly recommend. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.